Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in our Chats with Emily, as we are calling our readings of the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We turn now in the Johnson edition to poem 357, God is a Distant, Stately Lover. This poem, really controversial, especially once it was shown after Emily's death and it was published. It's another definition poem. The publishing history here is one that is worth our time. I'm going to let Johnson tell it. This is the way Johnson talks about this poem, quite a compelling history. He says it this way: this poem has an unusual publishing history. While the second series of poems of 1891 was being assembled, Mrs. Todd, who intended to include the lines there, sent them to S.J. Barrows, editor of a Boston weekly religious journal, the Christian Register. She evidently hoped their pre-publication would give a foretaste of Emily's wit, unconventionality in treating sacrosanct themes, theological themes as well. Barrows was delighted with the poem, shared her reasons for submitting it. Quote, "With that, we might always think that genius had its Easter," end quote, he comments in thanking her, end quote again, and was not buried in the tomb. And then published this in an issue of 2nd of April, 1891. His position, however, credibly intellectually, proved editorially unsound. I've had two quotes, he says to Miss Todd, I have two quotes, he wrote Miss Todd on the 22nd of April, from readers who have been greatly shocked by the poem of Emily Dickinson, which I published, and Reverend Brooke Herford, who forwarded one of them, says, quote, "It is one of the most offensive bits of contemptuous Unitarianism that I have met with," end quote. Herford was a Unitarian minister of the Arlington Street Church in Boston. Barrows, seeing nothing more irreverent in it than in the metaphors of the Song of Solomon or in the representation of the church as the bride of Christ in the Apocalypse, continues, quote, "But it makes some difference whether such a poem has the stamp of traditional authority upon it or not," end quote. To soothe offended readers, Johnson now finishes, Barrows carried an editorial in the last April issue of the Register, stoutly defending Emily's position and incidentally his own. The poem then creates all kinds of controversy among theological readers. Now, why this is the case, we'll have to obviously deal with. By the way, we're back to poem 49 in our study, and our assumption is that you've been following our stuff at LearnStrong.net. Down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hopeful that you've worked with our set of introductory comments. I'm hopeful that you've worked with our preceding 356 poems. We just finished with 356 the day I was crowned. Now, there's a lot of interesting knowledge that's required to really read this poem. The great scholar Priest has said it this way: in an old New England tale, John Aldine, and by the way, this is Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's The Courtship of Miles Standish of 1858. John Aldine, who was in love with the fair Priscilla, sent his friend Miles Standish to woo her in his place. And in this witty poem, Emily uses John Aldine for God, Miles Standish for Jesus, and the fair Priscilla for mankind. She begins with the neat point that the two situations are exactly similar, for God sent his son to woo us, just as John Aldine sends Miles to woo Priscilla. Of course, she concludes with an even neater point. In the story, it so happened that Priscilla chose Miles, not John Aldine, and Emily comments that if mankind behaves in the same way as Priscilla and chooses Jesus rather than God, God will merely state with, quote, hyperbolic archness that he and Jesus are one and the same person anyway. It is a way for Emily to play around with a theological question. Can you accept Jesus instead of God, as Emily clearly has done throughout a number of our poems, as being more relatable, we might say. Now, in some ways, this poem is a response to John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, as well as John 8:16, my judgment is true, for I am not alone, but I and the Father are one. The idea that God sends Jesus as an emissary, and yet God and Jesus are the same, will be the very notion that Emily is playing with here. Now, it is not unusual, as we have already pointed out, for Emily to dance the dance, if we'll say it this way, with God and theology. You'll remember in her poetry that she will assign to God any number of earthly roles: burglar, banker, father, amputee, noted clergyman, bold person, old neighbor, merchant, jester, experimental scientist, just to name a few, as one scholar has pointed out. Emily's clearly playing around, however, with this allegory and, of course, with Longfellow's poem. This is the way she says it. God is a distant, stately lover, woos, as he states us, by his Son. Verily, a vicarious courtship. Miles and Priscilla were such a one. But lest the soul like fair Priscilla choose the envoy and spur the groom, vouches with hyperbolic archness, Miles and John Alden were synonym. Now, it is interesting that she will play a radical first line game of God as a distant, stately lover. Guys, it doesn't seem as radical to us today, but readers of this poem early on were very offended by the very notion of what kind of lover is God. And then the idea that God woos, asks us to celebrate him by sending the emissary of his Son, is very much like a vicarious courtship between, as we've said already, Miles and Priscilla, as sent by John Alden in, of course, Longfellow's poem. But then she'll say these two stories are one. She'll bring the allegories together, if you will. But lest the soul, like fair Priscilla, will choose the envoy, right, that is to say Miles, and spurn the groom, that is to say John Alden, notice, vouches with hyperbolic archness. By the way, those two words only get used one time in all of Emily's poetry, and it is in fact here archness as in mischief. That is to say, that it seems as if God maybe is exaggerating a little bit here by simply pointing out that Miles and John Alden in the end were synonymous, even though of course technically they were not. This takes us of course to John 10:30, I and the Father are one. Emily's theology here, of course, is controversial. What is she really suggesting? That in her reading of Christian theology, God has sent Jesus, his Son, as an emissary to invite all of us to become Christians and therefore to be with God. And yet, Emily will make the argument, often in her poetry, that she will find Jesus far more relatable than God. God, it seems, is a stately lover, kind of beyond. And it's the emissary, the one who seeks to woo through for God through Jesus, that it will be more relatable. At 2b, well, there's any number of ways to kind of think about the language of this poem. Think about all the alliterative power of stately, state, son, soul, spurn, senom, verily, vicarious, vouches, and then as well the assonance game here of verily and vicarious, and the consonance game of distant, stately, states, us, vicarious courtship, Priscilla, such, lest, soul, Priscilla, like, vouches, archness. Emily's in fine form here. Notice her wit is as well at play, we should point out. Of course, at 3a, it's Longfellow's The Courtship of Miles Standish of 1858. Finally, at 3b, to own a poem like this that can be a little bit obscure, especially if you're not familiar with the theological observations that she's making. How do you play the game of understanding that synonymous, as she uses the word, only time ever used synonym, between Christ and God as being co-equals? Obviously, we can go back to our study of Milton's Paradise Lost to play more of that game as well. Thank you.